You can't do that. You're useless. What makes you think you can handle this situation? Today, we're going to be talking about our inner critic. This is Take Action Challenge number 6. We're 6 in. This is also an internal challenge. So we will be working ourselves into some challenges, of course, where we go out and handle things in the real world. And of course, you can modify this challenge as well so that you can test some of the criticisms, the inner critic things you have, and see what happens. So, let's talk a little bit about the inner critic. We can also think of this as our ants thoughts or our automatic negative thoughts. And just like the ants handout from Dr. Richard's series tries to get you to separate yourself from your thoughts, and many other fields of psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy do the same, the inner critic is also kind of separating you out from your thoughts. So the critic is one person, you as a rational person are someone else. So our inner critic, what we have to realize is social anxiety makes it difficult to have relationships, but the most important relationship you have is with yourself. And often it's this relationship with yourself that can be damaged by a lot of the negative things that your ants thoughts or your inner critic is saying to yourself. So your inner critic can make you hyper sensitive to criticism. You could be having a conversation with a stranger or a friend, and then all of a sudden the inner critic comes in, and you're trying to handle your inner critic, and at the same time you're trying to have a meaningful conversation with your friend, which makes it difficult and sometimes near impossible, of course, because the inner critic is telling you, don't go there, don't be vulnerable, don't say that. So looking at it that way, your inner critic is trying to protect you, but doing it in a tyrannical or a way that can be more harmful. So it might be trying to protect you short term, but it's more harmful for your long-term progress. It's better to be open, to be vulnerable, and have those conversations. So let's get down to some of the details. What is the action step? So there's 4 steps or so, depending on how you look at it, on tackling this inner critic. The first step is awareness, or noticing what the inner critic is saying. So often this is happening, these thoughts are happening subconsciously. They're happening, you're not totally aware, you're just reacting. So we can use our handy journal, of course, to write down some of the thoughts or some of the things the inner critic is saying. We're creating awareness. We're noticing when we're having these thoughts. So that is a first step in changing. We first have to notice that it's actually happened. All right, so maybe you could write it down as my inner critic is saying, or my automatic negative thought, my answer saying that I'm no good, for example, or that I can't do this. So you're saying my inner critic is saying, not I'm saying. You're separating yourself out from the thought. Number 3, we're going to turn the thought around. So we're going to kind of challenge what the inner critic is saying with our rational thoughts that we can have. And you can do this out loud, and of course you can do it in your journal. You can kind of be your own coach and coach yourself, put yourself back on track, challenge some of these thoughts. So that is the final step, of course, is to turn that thought around and say, I can do this, or maybe I can do this. Perhaps my inner critic is just waging a propaganda campaign against me. Perhaps I should challenge it. So that leads us to our action step. And our action step is really only step one. Now you can go through all 4 steps, and I'd recommend you do that if you can. But for 10 days or so, maybe more, try to have an awareness and notice what your inner critic is saying. Recognize the critic, notice what he's saying, write it down in your journal, or say it out loud to yourself. My inner critic is saying that I can't talk to this authority figure, for example. So for this step, I'm going to, what I thought I would challenge my inner critic on. This happened last night. I was at an anxiety type group, and one of the things about this group is hugging is encouraged. Of course, with social anxiety, my inner critic tells me I don't want to hug. I especially don't want to hug men. The handshake is the protocol for men. I don't want to have to initiate a hug. I often will hug and enjoy a hug if it's initiated by someone else, but I find it awkward to initiate the hug. So my inner critic is saying, you don't know this person well enough to initiate a hug. This person is a male. A handshake is more appropriate. So I noticed those thoughts, and I went in noticing those thoughts, and I said, I'm going to hug every person in this group. So what happened was at the beginning of the meeting, they were all sat down, and I did hug some of them. Of course, then we all had our meeting, all had our discussion, that type of thing, and then came to the end. And when it came to the end, now I said, I got to complete my challenge. My inner critic is telling me it's easier just to get out of here and leave the situation, give a few handshakes, hug people that want to hug me, and leave it at that. But I said, no, let's just challenge that inner critic. Let's just go up and initiate a hug. If someone don't want to hug, that is up to them. So when I did this, people were not only open and receptive, but it also allowed a little more conversation, a little more small talk, and a little bit more of a connection. So by turning that around and saying, my inner critic is saying that I can't hug people, I turned that around and said, coached myself and said, listen, you can initiate a hug. Maybe they won't hug back. Maybe they will. It's no big deal. I turned those thoughts around, and then the final step is to pat yourself on the back after you've done this, whether it was successful or not. If you've talked your inner critic and you've gotten through it and did what you wanted to do, you have some feedback. So you pat yourself on the back, you give yourself a little hug, and you say, listen, you did this, you set out to do it, you said you were going to do it, you followed through. This is great. And this kind of dullens the inner critic a little bit. He's losing a little bit of his power or his control over you. This tyrant is becoming just a little bit weaker. So that's it. The challenge again is to at least notice what your inner critic is saying. Of course, you can follow the steps. You can become aware or notice. You can change it to my inner critic is saying, or my aunt's thoughts are saying, ... You can turn those thoughts around, and then you can coach yourself and pat yourself on the back when you've been successful or not successful, depending how you define. I'd say if you challenge the thoughts, it was a success. So let's remember that this is very open. So depending on where you're at in your social anxiety or your shyness, you can modify this. All you have to do is notice a couple of thoughts and you've completed the challenge. Or you can go out and tackle some of your highest inner critic challenges if you want. Comment on it, leave some feedback, and good luck. We're well into the challenges. This is number 6. We are doing great. You rock.